I'm going to go ahead and turn to 2 Kings 4. 2 Kings 4, we'll get started there in just a moment. Before we do, we want to go through the outline of the book of Kings. And as we've said each week, we've outlined the two books of Kings together. The first 11 chapters of 1 Kings was the reign of Solomon. And then beginning at chapter 12 and going through chapter 17 of 2 Kings is going to be the divided kingdom. So we're still in that divided kingdom right now, today in 4, 5, and 6. And then 18 through 25 of 2 Kings is the fall of both Israel and Judah. At the same time, we're studying through 2 Chronicles. Again, like last week, we won't be in 2 Chronicles tonight, but I do want to keep the outline before us as a reminder. We'll be back in 2 Chronicles next week. 1 to 9 was the reign of Solomon. 10 to 36 is the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom, and also during Judah alone. It is still in that time frame that Israel is the first kingdom to fall. But let's talk about 2 Kings chapter 4. Get into the text for this evening. As we begin in 2 Kings chapter 4, we have the story here of Elisha first and the widow's oil in beginning at verse 1 and going through verse 7. It says, beginning at verse 1, "Now a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, 'Your servant my husband is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves.' And Elisha said to her, 'What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?' And she said, 'Your maidservant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil.' Then he said, 'Go borrow vessels at large for yourself from all your neighbors, even empty vessels. Do not get a few. And you shall go in and shut the door behind you and your sons, and pour out into all these vessels, and you shall set aside what is full.' So she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons, and they were bringing the vessels to her, and she poured. And when the vessels were full, she said to her son, 'Bring me another vessel.' And he said to her, 'There is not one vessel more.' And the oil stopped. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, 'Go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on the rest.' So here she comes to him after her husband has died. The creditor is coming to take away her 2 sons, and she comes to Elisha and says what to him here in verse 1?
She explains the situation that just tells him that her husband feared the Lord, and that these creditors are going to take her children.
Right, you know your servant feared the Lord, and here these creditors they're trying to take away my children from me, she's telling him. And so as he's talking to her here, he says, 'What do you want me to do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?' Okay, so the creditors are coming because there's a debt to be paid. That's why they're taking away her sons. 'Tell me what you want me to do for you. Tell me, what do you have?' And her reply is, 'I have what? Oil.' That's it. Nothing except a jar of oil. Even at that, it's not like she has an overabundance of oil in her house. She's got what? A jar. And so Elisha tells her to go do what? Go borrow some vessels from all your neighbors, and don't get a few. You need to gather a lot of vessels to bring. And what is she to do when she gets there? Her and her sons, when she gets all the vessels gathered. Right, go into the house and take the vessels, and she's going to pour this oil into the vessels. Now I want you to think about this for just a second. As you think about this woman here, and the kind of faith she's demonstrating by the fact that she's fixing to do exactly what Elisha said, Elisha has told this woman to take a single jar of oil, to go gather a whole bunch of vessels, come back to her house, and pour that single jar of oil into all those vessels. I'll tell you something. That sounds like an absolutely crazy idea from the human standpoint. It makes absolutely no sense. So she went from him, verse 5, and shut the door behind her and her sons. They were bringing the vessels to her, and she poured. You can't help but appreciate the faith of this woman here, that as Elisha said, here's what you need to do. And she knows that he's a prophet here. She comes to him to ask him, and as she's talking to him, her faith is, okay, I'm going to take and do exactly what you told me to do. I'm going to take these empty vessels and pour the oil in it, and the oil fills the vessels. to the point that she runs out of vessels before she runs out of oil. She turned to her son and said, "Bring me another vessel." And he said, "There's not one vessel more. There's no more vessels. We have filled all the vessels we have had." And so then the oil, this single jar of oil that she had, stopped. So she comes back to Elisha in verse 7, and as she comes to him, he tells her to go sell the oil. And it's going to do two things. What's it going to do? Pay the debt, and you can live on the rest. So this oil, this woman's faith, because she was willing to listen to what Elisha told her to do, to take these vessels, to pour the oil into them. She's willing to do this. She does this and has all of this oil, and she has this kind of faith in God that she listens to the instructions of the prophet Elisha. She had enough to pay her debt, so her sons were not taken away, and she had enough to live on. Can't help but appreciate the faith of this woman in this text. As she listens to what Elisha says and the instructions that she's told, and pours that one jar of oil into the vessel, into several vessels, and is able to live off of it. Can't help but appreciate her faith in this text.
I think she knew up front that he was a man of God.
Right, she did. Right, she knew that. It says in verse 1 that she's a woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets, cried out to Elisha. And she knows and believes by her actions as well in the one true God. And it's pointed out, your servant, my husband is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord. So you see the kind of background and what the family she's been in. And so that's what ultimately allows her. She already has a faith in God. So when this man of God tells her what to do, she does it. That's a good point. It's great diligence that she's told, not a few. What's not a few? You think about it, is 10 not a few? Well, to some people, 10's probably not a few. It's a little more than a few. 20, 30. Right. And we don't know how many she gathers, but we know she gathers enough that this is all able to take place to pay off the debt. We don't know what the debt is, but we know the debt was enough that they were taking both of her children for whatever this debt was. So it seems to be some substantial amount of debt that is to be paid. And here she pays it from that one jar of oil and a bunch of empty vessels. Yes?
Her action was a true act of obedience, and it paid off.
Yes, it did. Absolutely. This is a true act of obedience on her behalf.
I think it's interesting, too, that how private the miracle was. It wasn't intended to be a public spectacle. It was one that was just between this woman's obedience to what Elisha said. And just to show privately to this woman God's mercy and grace towards those who have faith and are obedient.
That's a good point. This wasn't something done in the streets where everybody saw. She went and borrowed vessels from her neighbors. They don't know what she's borrowing vessels for. And she goes into her room, as she's told. She goes into the house, and she shuts the door behind her. It's her and her two sons, and then Elisha that gave the instructions. And that takes place. It's a good point. This wasn't something that everybody saw. And yet here this woman is. She understands now the mercy and the grace of God, absolutely. Beginning at verse 8 now, we have the story of Elisha and the Shunammite woman. It begins in verse 8 by saying, "There came a day when Elisha passed over to Shunem, where there was a prominent woman, and she persuaded him to eat food, and so it was, as often as he passed by, he turned into there for food. So she said to her husband, Behold, now I perceive this is a holy man of God passing by us continually. Please let us make a little walled upper chamber, and let us set a bed for him there, and a table, and a chair, and a lampstand. And it shall be, when he comes to us, that he shall turn in there. And one day when he came there and turned into the upper chamber and rested, he said to Gehazi, his servant, Call this Shunammite. And when he had called her, she stood before him. He said to him, Say now to her, Behold, you have been careful for us with all this care. What can I do for you? Would you be spoken for to the king or to the captain of the army? And she answered, I live among my own people. So he said, What then is to be done for her? And Gehazi answered, Truly she has no son, and her husband is old. He said, Call her. And when he had called her, she stood in the doorway. Then he said, At this season next year you will embrace a son. And she said, No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your maidservant. The woman conceived and bore a son at that season the next year, as Elisha had said to her. You think about this woman here as you back up into verse 8 and 9, that Elisha is passing through Shunem continually. And it's not like when we're traveling today. Back in this time when you're traveling, you don't stop by McDonald's and grab something to eat as you're passing through. You don't go in a sit-down restaurant and find a place to eat. This isn't nothing like our day and time. As you're traveling through, what were you relying on? Hospitality of others. You're relying on other people being hospitable. Well, here's this woman who's being hospitable to Elisha, and so as he comes through there, he turns into there, and she gives him food to eat. But you notice in verse 9, and we don't know all what's taking place as Elisha has come in to eat, but we know this much. Whatever has taken place, she can tell what? He's a man of God. What all took place for her to know that, we don't know, but we know that there was something that she could tell. This is obviously a man of God. I perceive this is a holy man of God passing by us continually. So what is her decision? What should they do? Make a place for him. They're going to make an upper room with a bed, a table, a chair, and a lampstand, and when he comes by, he can pass in there. He's passing through here continually. Let's do that. So Elisha comes back through again, and there's this room prepared for him to turn into. He goes into the room, and he sends his servant to ask her what he could do for her. And she said, that there was nothing, and so his servant Gehazi came back to him and said that truly she has no son and her husband is old. Elisha wants to know, what should we do? And that's Gehazi's answer. So Elisha has her called to him and tells her what? You're going to have a son. At this season next year, you will embrace a son. And she said to him, No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your maidservant. There's something I know right off the bat. Here in verse 9, she recognizes him to be a man of God. Yes, she's having trouble down here grasping what he's telling her. She understands he's a man of God, but she's having a hard time grasping at this point that what he's telling her, this is really going to be the case. In fact, she says, Don't lie to me. Now, as Elisha's servant points out, she has no son and her husband is old. Perhaps they had been trying for many years and figured that maybe they just weren't going to have kids. We don't know all of this, but she doesn't think that this is going to be the case. Well, as it's told to her in verse 16, that this season next year she will embrace a son. She conceived and she bore a son when? That time next year. This is amazing here. It's not just that Elisha tells her in verse 16 that she's going to have a son. He tells her at this very season, next year, you're going to have a son. And at that very season, the next year, she has a son. And so you have to think at this point that this is probably something that's increasing her faith as she hears this. She knows she's a man of God. Here he's told her at this season next year you're going to have a son. It seems likely here at this case she probably never thought she'd have a child, and yet at that season the next year she embraced a son. So you have to think this has to be increasing her faith. Do what? There was doubt there initially there in verse 16. No, don't lie to me. She's doubting what she's being told, but now it's coming to pass. You have to think there's got to be some faith there on her behalf. Look at verse 18. As the child was grown, the day came that he went out to his father to the reapers. And he said to his father, my head, my head. And he said to his servants, carry him to his mother. And when he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her lap until noon and then died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. Then she called to her husband and said, please send one of your servants and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and return. He said, why will you go to him today? It is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath. And she said, it will be well. Then he saddled a donkey and said to her servant, drive and go forward, do not slow down the pace for me unless I tell you. So she went and came to the man of God to Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her at a distance, he said to Gehazi his servant, behold, there is the Shunammite. Please run now to meet her and say to her, is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the child? And she answered, it is well. And when she came to the man of God to the hill, she caught hold of his feet. And Gehazi came near to push her away, but the man of God said, let her alone, for her soul is troubled within her, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. Then she said, did I ask for a son from my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? Then he said to Gehazi, gird up your loins and take my staff in your hand and go your way. If you meet any man, do not salute him. And if anyone salutes you, do not answer him, and lay my staff on the lad's face. The mother of the lad said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. And he arose and followed her. The Gehazi passed on before them and laid the staff on the lad's face, but there was no sound or response. So he returned to meet him and told him, the lad has not awakened. And when Elisha came into the house, behold, the lad was dead and laid on his bed. So he entered and shut the door behind them both and prayed to the Lord. And he went on the child to put his mouth on his mouth, and his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself on him, and the flesh of the child became warm. Then he returned and walked into the house once back and forth, and went up and stretched himself on him. And the lad sneezed 7 times, and the lad opened his eyes. He called Gehazi and said, call this Shunammite. So he called her. And when she came into him, he said, take up your son. Then she went in and fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground, and she took up her son and went out. So you think here, as you back up in the story to the beginning part of verse 18, in this last section about the Elisha and the Shunammite woman, here this child is out in the field with his father. He's out there with his father and the reapers, and he comes crying to his father, my head, my head. The father says, take him back to his mother. And he goes back to his mother, and he sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. What is the first thing that comes to the mind of the Shunammite woman to do after this takes place? Go to the prophet. Go to Elisha. In fact, when she takes him, you notice something here. Where does she take and lay him in the house before she leaves? She takes him to where Elisha stayed, to the room that was there for Elisha to stay in, and laid him on that bed, and then had her husband saddle up a donkey and give the servant, and then went on. She comes to Elisha, and he sent out a servant to ask, is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the child? She said, it is well. But then she comes and is at Elisha's feet. And Elisha said at that point that he could tell that she was troubled. You know, her soul is troubled within her in verse 27, but the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. Elisha can tell she's troubled, but the Lord has not told Elisha why she's troubled. So then she comes to him and says, did I ask for a son from my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? It seems at this point Elisha now knows what's going on. She seems at this point here, her first response is go to the prophet, but when she gets here she asks, did I ask for a son? Did I say, do not deceive me? You know, she seems at this point almost like she's pointing the finger at Elisha right off the bat, like I didn't ask for a son. You said I would have a son. I did have a son, and now he's dead. So Elisha turns to his servant and tells him to do what? Go take the staff, go straight to the house. Don't greet anybody. If somebody greets you, just keep on going. Go lay the staff on the child's face. The Shunammite woman does not want to leave without Elisha. So Elisha leaves with the Shunammite woman. They're head on their way. As they're headed on their way, Gehazi, his servant, passes them by, goes first to the house, lays the staff on the child's face, and what happens? Nothing. No sound, no response. So he comes back and he tells Elisha, there was no sound, there was no response. So Elisha comes to the house and he goes in and he spreads himself out on the child, prays to the Lord, spreads himself out on the child, gets up, walks around the room, does the same thing again. The child sneezes 7 times and opens his eyes. And they call on his mother and she comes and gets him. Again, you have to think at this point, if she's seen this, what has she got to realize at this point? Truly, this is the man of God. He came in, he prayed to the Lord, he spread himself out on the child, and the child that had sat on her lap to noon and then died, she leaves there, goes to get Elisha, she comes back, and now he is raised from the dead. By the way, the story sounds awfully familiar. Where did we read of a very similar situation taking place not that long ago? Elijah, with the widow that he stayed with. And her son died. And this very same kind of thing happened. Well, last week when we were studying about Elijah and Elisha, what did Elisha ask for? Double portion of spirit. Elijah told Elisha that he would know that that was going to happen if he saw what? Elijah being taken away. There the mantle was left. We talked about the fact that he struck the mantle on the water last week and it parted, just like it did for Elijah. Now here he raised this child from the dead. Miracle very similar to what Elijah did. By the way, the first thing that we read in this text where he tells the woman to go pour the stuff is somewhat similar to the woman that same woman that Elijah had stayed with, whose oil did not run out in the time that Elijah was there with her during a famine. And here this woman in Elisha's case. So you see a lot of similarities in some of the things taking place between Elijah and Elisha, and some of the miracles taking place between the two of them. So this sounds familiar as you're reading through it, as if you heard it not that long ago, because we did. It's very similar to what took place with Elijah over in First Kings.
Have you ever wondered why the staff didn't work?
You know, that's a good question. And I think part of that, too, with the staff is it may have been in part that she needed to understand, maybe she needed to see Elisha go there himself. I don't know what the exact reason is. That's a good question.
I'm not sure if that was an assumption on Elisha's part, that he assumed that his staff, that just his staff would work, or if it was because of the woman's faith in Elisha himself. So
That's a good question, and either one of those are possibilities. But it does seem she has a lot of faith in Elisha himself. Maybe this was necessary that Elisha come all this way. Of course, we don't know. It's not told to us. Simply because she's now questioning Elisha himself about, I said not to deceive me, and maybe he needed to go himself for her to understand he truly is a man of God. But we don't know for sure anything from specifics of that in this text.
I was the same thing, but I was thinking more right up, I think in the next chapter about, his grief. Maybe he wasn't the right man for that. He was thinking something holy, but he himself was not holy.
That's also a good point. It could have to do with Elisha's servant, because of the things we're fixing to learn of when we get to study about him in a second, after we talk about him and Naaman here in chapter 5 in just a moment. Before we get into chapter 5, we want to get there quickly so we can spend a little bit of time there because our time is quickly getting away from us. We have the case of Elisha and this poisonous stew. He comes to Gilgal in verse 38, and there was a famine in the land, and the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, and he said to his servants, "Put on the large pot and boil the stew for the sons of the prophets." Then one went out into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine and gathered it from his lap full of wild gourds and came and sliced them into the pot of stew, for they did not know what they were. So they poured it out for the men to eat, and as they were eating of the stew, they cried out and said, "O man of God, there is death in the pot." And they were unable to eat. But he said, "Now bring meal." He threw it into the pot and said, "Pour it out for the people that they may eat." Then there was no harm in the pot. So you think about this here as this is taking place in this this stew again. And one of the things with Elisha we see a lot of, when we see him here, is a lot of miracles taking place in the days of Elisha. And here's the one where they come to him and they cut up these wild gourds and they put them in the stew, and they don't realize it's going to kill them. They don't realize it was poisonous. They were just trying to there's a famine in the land. They found these wild gourds. They thought, well, this is a good idea. We'll put it in the stew. They do, and then the men cry out, there's death in the pot. What we're eating is going to cause us to die. And so Elisha pours in the meal, and then what happens to it? It's fine. It's fine. They can eat it. And again, this has got to serve as a sign to the people that truly this is a man of God, and it ought to serve as a sign to the people that they need to make a change in their lives and realize they need to serve God because they haven't been serving Him as He is. So when Elisha brings, if Elisha's warning them, here's where you need to change, they ought to realize, well, maybe we need to change in this area, because think of all the other things that are taking place in the days of Elisha and all the miracles he's working. This is truly a man of God, and so if he's warning us that we need to be changing from what we're doing, it's serving as a sign to them that they should be changed. Never brings about the full change that they need to as the people of Israel, but that's something that serves as a sign to them that this really is a man of God. This isn't somebody just claiming to speak on behalf of God, but the miracles he's working and these things taking place serve as a sign to them that truly this man is a servant of God. We come on into chapter 5 now, on a story that's well familiar with us of the healing of Naaman. Naaman was a captain of the army of the king of Aram, verse 1. He was a great man with his master and highly respected, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy. Naaman went in and told his master, saying, Thus and thus spoke the girl who is from the land of Israel. Then the king of Aram said, Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. He departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 changes of clothes. So again, we talk about the signs of the things that have taken place with Elisha ought to serve as a reminder to the people, and something the people ought to see that truly this is a man of God. Well, this young lady out of Israel, this little girl out of Israel that is serving Naaman's wife, she knows that he's a man of God. Because she points out that, if he were the prophet who's in Samaria, he could cure him of his leprosy. We don't know what all she saw took place, how many miracles she might have seen taking place before she was taken captive. But we know this, she saw something that convinced her that if Naaman wanted to be healed of his leprosy, he needed to go see the prophet that's in Samaria. It's talking about Elisha. He needs to go see him. He needs to go see the prophet in Samaria. So he goes to the king of Aram, Naaman does, and he gets letters to send to the king of Israel. So he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, And now as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But consider now, and see how he is seeking a quarrel against me. So here is the king of Aram sends this letter to the king of Israel. What is the letter asking for? The king to cure him. Now, the king is in Samaria, but that's not the prophet in Samaria. But when the king of Aram addresses it, he addresses it to the king. Take this to the king, that you may cure him of his leprosy. What's the king of Israel's response? Am I God? Can I kill and make alive? How is it that I'm going to cure this man of his leprosy? You would think so. Absolutely, you would think so with all the things that have taken place. And the fact that Elisha's right here. It's not like Elisha's far away at this point. He's been doing work among the kings. The kings have seen the work of Elijah and Elisha. They know Elisha was with Elijah. It was one of those things that surely he would have known, but he's sitting at this point wanting to know, how am I going to cure him? In fact, he thinks the king of Aram is just wanting to seek a quarrel against him, a good reason to come out and fight against him. I sent my servant to you. Why didn't you heal him? So he thought that he was just sort of trying to spark a war with Israel. But Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes. He sent word to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman comes with his horses and his chariots and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent out messengers, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean. But Naaman was furious and went away and said, Behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in rage. I want you to think about Naaman's response here for just a second, and some things that we can learn from Naaman's response. As Elisha sends out word, he tells him to dip 7 times in the Jordan River. Go wash himself 7 times in the Jordan River. Again, we talked about this when it came to this widow earlier back in chapter 4. Sometimes things from the human standpoint just don't make sense. Yet in the first chapter she obeyed. Well, here in Naaman, it doesn't make sense. There seems to be no rhyme or reason for him to go dip in the Jordan River or wash in the Jordan River 7 times. How is it that doing that is going to make himself better? In fact, his response is, in verse 11, Behold, I thought. I think that's something dangerous right there in verse 11. Behold, I thought. Here, there's what Naaman is expecting. You know, Naaman says here that he thought surely he'd come out and stand out and he'd call on the name of the Lord and he'd wave his hand over the place and then Naaman would be cured. That's what Naaman thought. Yet that's not what Elisha says. In fact, he complained because he thought the Abana and the Pharpar and the rivers of Damascus were all better than the rivers of Israel. Don't you think about this for just a second. It didn't make sense to Naaman, so he wasn't going to obey. It wasn't what Naaman thought ought to be done, so Naaman wasn't going to obey. And there was, again, more logical explanation or more logical things to Naaman to be done, and so he wasn't going to obey. Those are some things that can keep us at times from obeying today. We can think it ought to be one way when God has said it is another. It might not make sense to us with the way that God has said it, and so we think that our way is a better way. And again, maybe we think that there's just a different way. There's got to be some way because this way just doesn't seem the best way at all or the most logical way at all, and so we're going to do it some other way. But his servants in verse 13, they come to him and said, My father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, Wash and be clean? You think about the wisdom here that his servants show as they come, and they say to him, Listen, if Elisha had come out to you and he had told you to do some great thing, would you have done it? If he'd have told you, here's some great deed that you need to do, and if you do this, you're going to be cured of your leprosy, would you have done it? Well, then why not? If he simply says to go wash in the Jordan River, do you not just go wash in the Jordan River? This wasn't some great thing. This wasn't some difficult thing that he told you to do. Just simply go wash in the Jordan River. Well, that makes sense to Naaman at this point. Okay, you're right. If he'd asked me to do some great thing, I would have done it. He said, dip in the Jordan River. This is a man of God, and I dip in the Jordan River, I'm going to be healed. So Naaman goes, he dips himself 7 times in the Jordan River, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored. He did exactly what Elisha told him he needed to do, and when he did that, his flesh was restored to him. But then we have Hazel, the servant of Elisha, showing some greed. Naaman comes and offers gifts to Elisha. He said in verse 17, if not, Naaman, he asked him first if he'll take something. In verse 15, Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel, so please take a present from your servant now. He said, Elisha, let me give you some gift. And Elisha says, no. So Naaman said, if not, please let your servant at least be given 2 mules, load of earth, for your servant will no longer offer burnt offerings, nor will he offer sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, where I bow in the house of Rimmon the Lord, pardon your servant in this matter. And he says, go in peace. So he departed from him some distance. Naaman realizes at this point there's only one God, and that's the God that's in Israel. He says, I'm not going to worship any other God. And Elisha tells him, go in peace, so he goes on and he departs some distance between him. But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, thought, behold, my master had spared this Naaman the Aramean by not receiving from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and take something from him. So Gehazi pursues him, and for time's sake, we'll move through this rather quickly, but he pursues him. He makes up this story about these two young men, the sons of the prophets that come to Elisha, and so we need these things to give to them, and Naaman gives it to him. And so he comes back in verse 25, and he went in and stood before his master, and Elisha says, where have you been, Gehazi? And what's his response? Your servant went nowhere. So Elisha looks at him and said, did not my heart go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Is it time to receive money and to receive clothes and olive groves and vineyards and sheep and oxen and male and female servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence a leper, as white as snow. So here, Naaman's cured of his leprosy at the beginning of this chapter because of his faith in God. When Elisha says, here's what you need to do, Naaman finally, after thinking, no, there's no reason to do it, does it on the word of his servants, and he realizes there's no God but the God in Israel. But Gehazi, the man that has been there beside Elisha, the servant of Elisha, who's been with him. By the way, remember in the previous chapter, where was Gehazi when this child was raised from the dead? He was right outside. He's the one that went first and laid the staff on his face. He's right outside. He's the one that Elisha says, go get the Shunammite woman and bring her here. And he's the one that goes and gets her and brings her to Elisha. Elisha, he's seen all of this Gehazi has in his time with Elisha taking place. Yet he's greedy. He wanted gain. He wanted to find some gain for the things that has taken place. And for the fact that Elisha's healed Naaman, and in the end he's punished by having leprosy. The leprosy of Naaman clings to him, and he was a leper, left Elisha's presence as a leper, as white as snow. And so because of his greed, he is punished. So here we have a story of a man who comes to learn of the true God and is cured of his leprosy. And then we have in the latter half a man who has been with the servant of God, who's been with the prophet of God all this time, and because of his greed, he now is a leper. One man was healed of his leprosy because he believed in the God, and the other man was greedy for gain, and he became a leper and had the leprosy of the man that was healed. Chapter 6. Elisha recovers an axe head here in 1-7. The sons of the prophets came to him and said, behold, now the place before you where we are living is too limited for us. Please let us go to the Jordan, and each of us take from there a beam, and let us make a place there for ourselves where we may live. So he said, go. Then one said, please be willing to go with your servants. And he answered, I shall go. So he went with them, and when he came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. And as one was a falling beam, the axe head fell into the water, and he cried out, alas, my master, for it was borrowed. Then the man of God said, where did it fall? And when he showed him the place, he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. He said, take it up for yourself. So he put out his hands and took it. So here this man has borrowed this axe, and the axe head falls off into the water. And because it's borrowed, what's he going to have to do? Replace it. I borrowed it, it fell apart. He comes to Elisha and he cries out to him. Elisha takes a stick, throws it in the water, axe head floats to the top. Doesn't really seem like a major miracle here taking place, but again, this is something that is going to serve as a sign to them. Think about these people that are all going to be gathered there working together that see this take place. Have to realize this is truly a man of God. What he's telling us is the truth. Yes. Had to be astonished as you watched in this iron just floated right to the top. Now here, beginning at verse 8, the king of Aram was warring against Israel, and this is where we have a story in the life of Elisha that is familiar to us. That as they're standing there, he's counseled with his servants, and such a place shall be my camp. This is the king of Aram as he's warring against Israel. And the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, saying, beware that you do not pass this place, for the Arameans are coming down there. So the king of Israel sent to the place about which the man of God had told him. Thus he warned him. so that he guarded himself there more than once or twice. Now the heart of the king of Aram was enraged over the thing, and he called his servants and said to them, "Will you tell me which of us is for the king of Israel?" One of his servants said, "No, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king the words that you speak in your bedroom." So he said, "Go and see where he is, that I may send and take him." And it was told him, saying, "Behold, he is in Dothan." And he sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city. So here they come, and they're going to take, they find, the king of Aram wants to know who is betraying us to the king of Israel, because he seems to know our every move. And one of the servants tells him, "No, it's not us, it's the prophet. It's Elisha the prophet who's telling him the things you speak in your bedroom. Things you're saying in private, Elisha's telling, this man of God is telling the king of Israel." Well, the king of Aram wants to find Elisha. His thought is, well, if Elisha's telling him what I'm doing before or in my very move to where he can anticipate it, then let's just get rid of Elisha and we get rid of that problem. So they come to surround the city in verse 14. Now when the attendant of the man of God had risen early and gone out, behold, an army with horses and chariots were circling the city. And his servant said to him, "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" So he answered, "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Elisha prayed and said, "O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see." And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And when they came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, "Strike this people with blindness, I pray." So he struck them with blindness. And as the story goes on, they're struck with blindness. Elisha takes them, leads them into Samaria, and tells them to open their eyes, and their eyes are open, and there they are in the midst of the people of Israel. Skipping down to verse 24 now, we have a siege on Samaria taking place when Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, has gathered all his army and went up and besieged Samaria. So Samaria has a great famine, and it's bad enough that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver and a fourth of a cob of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. It was so bad that a donkey's head and dove's dung were delicacies in Samaria. That's how bad it has come there. In fact, it's come to the point that they resulted to cannibalism later on as they're boiling and eating their children. That's what's taking place here in the Siege of Samaria. Here, as you go throughout the rest of that, that's how bad things have gotten here in Samaria, as they're being sieged by the king of Aram. Let's move on real quick. We've got just a couple of minutes left and talk about some practical lessons. Some of these are things we've seen several times before, but we see something about the power of God and all the miracles that are being worked here throughout this text. Several times where Elisha's working these miracles, or in the case of delivering them at Dothan from the Arameans. I think we see something of the importance of hospitality, that this woman is willing to show it here in this text to Elisha, a man that she finally figures out he's a man of God, but she doesn't really know who he is when he turns in the first time. It's not like this is a long-lost friend that's just passing by and she knows him, but she shows him hospitality here, and I think we learned something about that. God is rewarding those who obey him. Think about the woman who obeyed about the oil. Think about Naaman, who obeyed concerning dipping in the Jordan River. Think about those as you go throughout these texts that are obeying what God has said. God is rewarding them. Greed can be a terrible thing. We learn that here with the servant of Elisha, Hazel, who is struck with leprosy because of his greed. And sometimes we may not realize how bad greed can be. But remember, in the New Testament, sometimes we think I think sometimes we think it is that money is the root of all evil, but it's what? The love of money. You know what that is? That's people that are being greedy and desiring more and more and desiring things. Like Hazel was here. That's a terrible thing. We need to obey God even when what he tells us to do from the human standpoint doesn't make sense. Naaman did. This widow did here back in the first chapter. Even though what they were told to do doesn't make sense from the human standpoint, they obeyed. And guess what happened? They're rewarded. Naaman's cured. And then she had enough to pay off her debt. And finally, we see the importance of having God on our side. Think about Elisha as he stands there and this attendant is worried there about what are we going to do as they besiege the city. And Elisha tells him, those that are with us are more than those that are with them. And then they're delivered there. And Elisha prays, his eyes are open, and they see it. We see the importance of having God on our side. Next week, we'll pick up in chapter 7. We'll also be in 2 Chronicles again next week.